I recently got into an argument on the internet. Try to contain your shock at this revelation. Anyway, the discussion was about socialism and the misunderstandings, deliberate or genuine, the liberals often have regarding it, and I thought it would be a good idea to turn it into a video, so here we are. I'm not really going to be discussing what actually counts as socialism or communism or whatever here, partly because that's a video everyone on BreadTube has made at this point, but also because it's probably more important now to define what socialism is not, since there's so much misinformation out there about it. So, let's discuss it, shall we? As I'm sure almost any leftist can attest, a pretty significant amount of responses to a rational and accurate description of what socialism actually is so you just want everyone to be self-employed, which, it misses the point so fucking spectacularly. The exchange usually goes something like this. To boil it down to its most basic form, socialism is simply the workers owning the means of production, or democratically owning and controlling their workplaces. But why does that require such a drastic change? Surely the best way for the worker to be guaranteed a reward for their work is to be self-employed and work within capitalism, and then follow some self-important diatribe about how being self-employed is the way to live, and how it's hard to begin with, but with hard work and grit, one can make it work, and actually anyone who doesn't is just a sheep or some shit, which, you know, fair. Be self-employed. Do it. Make something people want. Set your price. Get the full reward for your labour. Do not expect corporations to recompense you well for your job. The most you can hope for is that you learn something. Corporations, like churches, care more about the institution than the people who make it up. Be self-employed. It's not easy, but it's the only way where Marx's dream of the worker getting the reward of their labour comes true. Do something that is hard and do it as well as you can. But that solution requires 1. Luck, 2. Skills in specific areas which one can market, 3. Motivation, and 4. Free time outside of work, none of which are guaranteed, especially under a repressive capitalist system. Also, this only works within capitalism. No one on the left is arguing for the implementation of communism within the existing system. In fact, we rather specifically believe that in order for what we deem a more just society to emerge, capitalism must fall. Plus, the idealization of self-employment is more of an individualist goal as opposed to a collectivist one, which is what most leftists prefer. After all, individualism is a core tenet of capitalism. Furthermore, if everyone became self-employed within capitalism, the economy would be totally fucked. Name me a business that could still function without employees, since if everyone's self-employed, no one's working for anyone else. I guess you could consider automation to be the thing that brings this about, but then you have to acknowledge that rather than improving our lives by taking away more difficult labour, automation actually makes our lives worse by forcing us into different forms of labour under capitalism. Under communism, of course, the workers would own their own workers collectively, and automation would help make the lives of people better, so this is not an issue. Therefore, your solution of just become self-employed cannot work for anything but a lucky minority. This kind of rhetoric seriously harms working people because it not only puts the onus on them to fix a systemic issue, at best puts a band-aid over the problem and is simply not workable in either the short or the long term. It helps a small minority of people, but the way our capitalist system works is simply not conducive to being solved by everyone becoming self-employed and no one ever having a job or working for someone else. This kind of simplistic thinking is typical of liberals and centrists, though, for the simple reason that they cannot fathom a solution to a problem that doesn't reflect the status quo in at least some capacity. The answer to a broken society, economy, and political system to these people is always more regulations, small tweaks to the system, more legalese, more reform. Everyone should just open a business. Everyone should be self-employed. But these problems fix nothing. Under socialism, homelessness and poverty would theoretically be fixed practically overnight. Under capitalism, it will never be fixed because so much profit can be made from exploiting the homeless and threatening the working class with homelessness should they fail to comply. Likewise, with poverty, where will the desperate exploitable workforce come from to do all these shitty, horrible, back-breaking jobs for basically nothing if they're not essentially forced into it by circumstances and, yes, poverty? Capitalism cannot be stopped, and its more pernicious aspects cannot be averted by simply making laws to restrict it. Not only will corporations and individuals do everything everything they can to find loopholes and even just break the law if they think they can get away with it, but they will also lobby politicians to relax said regulations down the line. Regulations are constantly being strengthened and weakened depending on who's in power, and often are just unenforceable. Like, I've found myself being let go from jobs as soon as it becomes clear that my employer will need to implement potentially costly workplace adjustments due to my disability, for example. Is it illegal for them to do that? Oh, absolutely, but can I prove that that's why? Did they admit that it was because I was disabled? Of course fucking not. Under capitalism, the capitalists have all the power, and they're not going to give it up just because you asked nicely or because you said they can't do specific things. They're still going to find ways to fuck people over in order to make as much money as possible. There's a reason that so many corporations outsource production jobs to third world countries. They stopped being able to exploit workers back home in such brutal fashion, so they just decided to start doing it somewhere they could. You think Nestle does half the shit it's responsible for in the third world because it doesn't realise what it's doing is wrong? It can't murder and torture people in the US or EU, but it can do in Africa. Coca-Cola can't use paramilitary death squads to murder union organisers in the West, but it can in Colombia. Reformism doesn't work because it doesn't change the fundamentals of capitalism. Those with power will do anything to attain more, regardless of local laws, especially the well-being of human beings, until you can bring a corporate regulation that eliminates or discourages the profit motive. It simply cannot work. Likewise, becoming self-employed is not an option because it's an individual solution to a systemic issue. In order for businesses to function, usually more than one person needs to work in them, and then all of a sudden you have to either form a co-op, or you, my friend, have just defeated the object of having a system where everyone is self-employed already. Because if everyone is self-employed, no one can be, employed. There are lengths to which the right and centre will go in order to justify the status quo. They frame the systemic issues here on individual choices and problems, not issues that society at large needs to deal with. It's like those people who got so caught up in the controversy surrounding the Joker movie that they came out with idiotic takes about how society has absolutely no bearing on a person's well-being or can encourage or cause violence in any way. Whilst refugee children are kept in concentration camps, the US prepares to justify military action in Iran, and the police regularly murder black people in their homes. The problem cannot be the system, because if it is, that might lead one to believe that maybe the system is flawed in some way and may need to change. And if your entire political ideology revolves around worshipping the status quo and are terrified by the idea of the status quo changing, well, it is of course therefore anathema to accept a drastic change to the status quo, especially one that might work. Hey, did you know that anarchism, syndicalism and socialism are all exactly the same thing as the USSR, modern China and North Korea? Have you seen shitty memes like this posted by the right and centre on social media and acting as if it's some sort of gotcha? Well, my friend, welcome to the tanky club. I guess we're all in it now. Or, not. But you may be thinking, doesn't the meme make a valid point? The USSR killed millions of people, as did Mao, and so on and so forth. They made the lives of their citizens significantly more difficult in a number of ways. They were brutal, cruel, and to associate with the same ideology they did is disgusting and despicable. There are a number of ways to respond to this. First, I could do the obvious thing of comparing these dictatorships to modern-day neoliberal capitalist states. I could argue, whilst it is terrible that the USSR, for example, carried out these horrendous acts of violence and suppression, it would be unfair to act like Western capitalist nations haven't committed equal or greater atrocities in the name of profit margins and increasing wealth for the super rich at the expense of the poor. I could say that actually capitalism kills more people than communism ever did, that capitalism has almost single-handedly not only directly and indirectly murdered workers, indigenous populations and people the world over, but through the systematic exploitation of the planet and its resources might actually be about to cause the fucking apocalypse as our own planet starts to kill us thanks to climate change, and that with that context, maybe it's a little unfair to continue to bash socialism for crimes committed under its name whilst ignoring the atrocities carried out in pursuit of profit. Second, I could make the assertion that actually, whilst a lot of awful, terrible things came out of these regimes, a lot of good came out of them as well. Stalin was unequivocally a fucking monster in many ways, but the fact that he managed to turn the USSR from a feudalist society to a heavily industrialized one in a very short period of time, and also for the most part the lives of those living under the USSR were on average significantly better both than those under the Tsar and also after the fall of the Iron Curtain. The average citizen of the Soviet Union was actually in many ways better off than someone living under Putin's current Russian Federation. The USSR was a superpower, the capitalist nation of Russia is not. But I'm not going to make either of those arguments. I'm not all that swayed by them myself, and I don't want to be mistaken for a tanky, so the only argument that makes sense to me is the following one. These nations, were not socialist. Yes, I know it's in the name, but as I pointed out before, technically North Korea is called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the only word in that acronym that makes any sense, of course, being Korea, and I guess the and of. The ruling party of China is called the Communist Party, but their economy is built almost entirely on capitalist enterprises, mostly from overseas. All those American companies that have factories in China, yeah, that wouldn't fly. So allow me to submit what I believe to be the best and most reasonable response to this argument. Put simply, unless the workers owned the means of production under these regimes, they weren't socialists. That's like the most fundamental definition of socialism. Overly simplistic perhaps, but accurate up to a point. A society cannot call itself socialist until or unless it commits to this most basic tenet of socialist doctrine. You know what they were though? State capitalist. See, a lot of the right and centre like to pretend that socialist means the government controlling everything, which I definitely see why, and it does justify a lot of the big government rabble-rousing that people like PragerU like to do, but true socialism requires by definition the people to directly own the means of production, not through the government, especially when said government is not even democratically elected, and therefore cannot really represent the people. State capitalism is an economic system in which the state undertakes commercial, i.e. for-profit, economic activity, and where the means of production are organised and managed as state-owned business enterprises, including the processes of capital accumulation and wage labour and centralised management, or where there is otherwise a dominance of corporatised government agencies organised along business management practices, or of publicly listed corporations in which the state has controlling shares. Marxist literature defines state capitalism as a social system combining capitalism with ownership or control by a state. By this definition, a state capitalist country is one where the government controls the economy and essentially acts like a single huge corporation, extracting the surplus value from the workforce in order to invest it in further production. Why do the people sharing memes like this continue to support capitalism and ignoring the lived experiences of immigrants from ex-Soviet nations, many of which were state capitalist? Before anyone jumps in and points out that capitalism and state capitalism are completely different things, may I take this opportunity to acknowledge that that is completely true, but also to point out that democratic socialism and communism are fundamentally different as well, but that doesn't stop anyone, including the creator of this meme, conflating the two. This whole line of argument could very easily be turned around on itself. I don't think that the billions of African peasants are dying of avoidable causes due to capitalism's inherent inability to adequately allocate resources such as food, water and medicines, despite all these things existing in extreme abundance, would be huge fans of the economic system that allowed their suffering to exist. The 1% could choose to end world hunger, poverty, homelessness, etc., but they don't. They make an active choice to allow these things to continue because of an economic system that encourages selfishness and individualism, and the rest of us have no possible way to force them to do the right thing. Is that really preferable? Furthermore, this argument isn't even attempting to criticise common and garden communists, tankies or anarchists such as myself. It instead takes aim at college-aged democratic socialists. What the fuck do they even have to do with post-Soviet and socialist states? That's a rhetorical question. I know it's because they both have the word socialism in them. Look, I know it may be confusing, but the term socialist is a little more complex and nuanced than a lot of people would like to acknowledge. Someone like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn aren't looking to enact some kind of authoritarian USSR-style dictatorship, at least that we know of. They just want to tax the rich and redistribute the wealth more equally and fairly. You can disagree with their methods, or even, I guess, their morals. Jeremy Corbyn has been dealing with a lot of accusations of anti-Semitism from the UK media, for example, but to compare them to authoritarian dictators of the past is nonsensical at best, and actively malicious misinformation at worst. It's Jordan Peterson level, and that's a low fucking level to reach. So what's the difference between socialism and democratic socialism, if they're not the same thing? Well, as a democratic socialist definition, the political scientist Lyman Tower Sargent proposes as follows. Democratic socialism can be characterized as follows. Much property held by the public through a democratically elected government, including most major industries, utilities and transportation systems, a limit on the accumulation of private property, governmental regulation of the economy, extensive publicly financed assistance and pension programs, social costs, and the provision of services added to purely financial considerations as the measure of efficiency. Publicly held property is limited to productive property and significant infrastructure. It does not extend to personal property, homes, and small businesses, and in practice, in many democratic socialist countries, it is not extended to many large corporations. Another example is the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, with the organization defining socialism as a decentralized, socially owned economy, stating, social ownership could take many forms, such as worker-owned cooperatives or publicly owned enterprises managed by workers and consumer representatives. Democratic socialists favor as much decentralization as possible. While the large concentrations of capital in industries such as energy and steel may necessitate some form of state ownership, many consumer goods industries might be best run as cooperatives. Democratic socialists have long rejected the belief that the whole economy should be centrally planned. While we believe that democratic planning can shape major social investments like mass transit, housing and energy, market mechanisms are needed to determine the demand for many consumer goods. I suspect this is more of an American thing, though not exclusively, as I have actually seen it over here as well. In Europe, we mostly see nationalisation as, well, nationalisation, because we have a lot of it here, notably of course the NHS, but it wasn't too long ago that we had a nationalised rail service as well as a number of energy companies. In fact, it was only really in the 80s that these things were privatised, and in the intervening decades many people have noticed the slow decline in quality of service coupled with the rise in prices and, unsurprisingly, aren't all that happy about it.
Hello. What do you do for a living? Work for British Gas, do you? You wanker. I'll give you put my bills up. Bastard, bang, you take that. You won't put them up no more. Bang, one for you and one for you. I'll give you one as well. You come here. I'll get you, you bastard. Come back. I'll give you central heating. You want central heating, babe? You've got it. Oh yeah, you take that. Oh, take my fucking money out the wall, will you? Scum, you won't get no more of my money. No, gas bastard. Scum, you're all scum. Ooh, take that, take that. Ooh. Where's the next bastard up? Hey! Hey! Come on, die! Oh, there you are, you bastards. We finally found you. British gas bastards, good. I'm gonna blow you to hell! Wankers! Wankers! Whee! This is it, you cunts! Let's have you! You... Oh! This is it! Die! Oh, that's it. That's the end of you lot.
As a result, with this stark difference being evident and, crucially, within living memory for a lot of people, the idea of nationalisation of industries isn't quite as taboo as it is across the pond, especially since we can compare our rail system, for example, to our European neighbours and see just how much worse our privatised system is than their nationalised ones, whilst not only costing the users more, but also the government. Anyway, this is a bit off topic. I don't want to get into a whole thing about nationalisation here. The point is that this isn't really an idea that we in Europe really get exposed to very often, but in the US, especially post-Red Scare, this misconception has been put about more than I have, and it's frankly just objectively incorrect, so let's just discuss it. To be fair, it is pretty easy to see where the misconception comes from. After all, to the uninitiated, a lot of far-left ideas do sound like free stuff. Eliminating homelessness, for example, or ensuring that no one goes hungry, or even something as ubiquitous throughout the developed world as nationalised healthcare, can seem like free stuff to the uninitiated. But of course this isn't true in much the same way as the big government scare tactic American right-wingers like to use isn't really a thing here, because we don't have quite the same obsession with individual liberty over public good. If the government can do a better job of running utility service than private companies, and considering the way things have generally gone under the privatised system, they probably can. Why not let them, you know? But the point here really is that much like the previous misconceptions here, this accusation misses the point. Socialists don't want to give anyone free stuff. The stuff will either be taken from what already exists or is produced. Currently, we produce enough food to feed 3 billion people more than already exist on Earth and house everyone on the planet, but we throw away huge amounts of food and leave homes empty. We're not giving anyone free stuff any more than providing free education or infrastructure as free stuff. We're merely redistributing resources that already exist in a more equitable way. But of course, demonising socialism and wealth redistribution is the point. It keeps the masses from being tempted by radical ideology, because last time that happened, the rich had to pay higher taxes and the workers were able to fight for their rights, and it stops the conversation about the 1% before it has a chance to get started in earnest. What, you think we should make sure no one has to starve, struggle for clean water, go homeless, or live in abject poverty? What are you, some kind of socialist? Socialism has been deliberately given a bad reputation by those in power, and the billionaire class who are the ones really getting all the free stuff through, for example, subsidies from the government and tax breaks. Ask yourself this: who stands to lose out from reappropriating Jeff Bezos' wealth wealth, the homeless and impoverished, or Jeff Bezos? The answer of course is neither, because Bezos is so rich that you wouldn't notice the loss of income. There's a widely shared quote from Margaret Thatcher, the woman who oversaw much of the privatisation in the 80s, which posits that the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money, which is usually brought up with a degree of smugness at this point, and I have to say it's a persuasive argument if you're politically illiterate and have no idea what socialism actually is, but if you have any fucking clue about what you're talking about, it immediately jumps out as hilariously misinformed. See, she's actually describing capitalism here. It's capitalism that extracts surplus value from the working class and funnels it upwards to the corporations and stockholders. Capitalism that cuts public services and squeezes the poor to breaking point while simultaneously giving the rich tax breaks. Tell me, who's more lazy? The homeless guy sitting outside Sainsbury's for 12 hours a day, asking everyone who passes by for spare change to afford a bed for the night, or the landlord sitting on his reliable income from desperate people with no choice but to pay up each month without having to lift a finger other than occasionally giving a plumber a call to go fix the boiler once every several years? The problem with capitalism is that eventually you'll run out of other people's lives.
Well, now ain't you a sight for sore eyes? Full-grown vultures walking around like real folk. Welcome! Welcome to Hell's Outhouse! Now they call us disappeared ones, but as you can see, we ain't exactly disappeared. We just been a little hard to find. Wait! You! I know you. You bet you do, Peckerwood. I'm the legendary Three-Finger Jack, and you are a bunch of murdering trash, dressed up in fancy, sweet-smelling doodads.
Ignore him, gentlemen. He's a common thief.
Ha! As common as they come, but I ain't nothing compared to you, gentlemen. I steal gold, I steal money, but you steal people's lives.
Socialism is not any of these things. Now, don't let me catch you doing this shit again in future. There's a lot of misinformation out there about what does and does not count as true socialism, and to be fair, there are a number of differing and in some ways contradictory definitions of it, but I would advise you to be careful when ascribing that term to anything that demonstrably doesn't fit it, otherwise we get people calling the Nazis socialists despite the fact that socialists were the first people to be put in the camps, or people claiming majority capitalist nations like China, which sells itself out and exploits its citizens for Western corporations, or Venezuela, 80% of the capital is owned by private enterprises, socialist. But most importantly of all, I beg of the liberals out there, please, for the love of God, do not try to justify the atrocities carried out under capitalism by making idiotic suggestions like telling everyone to become self-employed. Capitalism's failures are endemic and specific to capitalism and cannot be fixed within capitalism, and certainly not by individual choices, at least not long term.
Moscow white, let the workers unite, a collective regime of peace and love. I work so hard in arranging the blocks, but the landlord and taxman bleed me dry. But the workers will rise, we will not compromise, for we know that the old regime must die. Long live Lenin, kill the Tsar. We salute the sick